Hello and welcome to the overview of the ethics paper. In terms of being an overview, what I'll do is go over sort of the core details of the paper, the requirements, how to turn it in, how it's graded, etc. There's also a detailed PDF file which goes over the paper step by step. And of course, the argument basics goes over in detail how to argue, looking at some useful inductive arguments that you might use in the paper but are not required to, and also the more extensive moral methods we'll look at after the paper in separate videos, goes over particular sort of argument templates you would use to make an argument for your position and raise an objection and reply to it. And you're not required to use any of the moral methods, the particular ones in your paper, and you're certainly not required to use all of them because, as we'll see, we'll go through quite a few. But without further ado, to the overview of the paper. So the paper is written in a draft, multiple drafts if you wish, and a final version. For the draft, you upload the draft if you do one to Canvas to a special draft assignment, and it's available until the date specified on the syllabus. Also, of course, you can look in Canvas to see when it's available until. And when you upload a draft, I go in using Canvas's commenting abilities to, mark it up, put it on comments, and it gets a hypothetical score, but the draft itself is not graded. And by that I mean I'll put a number on it saying what you would get if this was the final version, but the draft does not count towards your grade or against it. So in this regard, drafts are like risk-free. It doesn't hurt your grade, doesn't help your grade directly, of course. And the draft can be turned in on Canvas up until that available until date. And the reason for that is because after that, that's the deadline for the final version. And so once the final version comes due, that's what I'll start grading. Now, if you upload the draft, it doesn't check for plagiarism. It doesn't get loaded into plagiarism checker for the obvious reason. If it did get loaded in the plagiarism checker and, got loaded into the system, you would repeatedly get flagged for plagiarizing yourself, and that would be a problem. So what if you want to check the paper for plagiarism possibilities beforehand? Oh, there's the plagiarism check assignment, which I've created. It isn't graded, it doesn't count for you, against you, and I don't even really look at it except to sort of clear it, clear the assignment out so it doesn't keep showing up in my to-do list. And what it allows you to do is upload an unlimited number of papers to check. It doesn't get loaded into the system itself because otherwise, once it's uploaded, it would start flagging itself, which should be, self-defeating, and it'll give you the report from turn it in. And this allows you to check your paper beforehand to see what the result would be, and to decide, what things you need to change. And if you're not familiar with Turnitin, very briefly, it checks, various internet sources, paper repositories, etc., and then gives you a report, gives you a number and flags things. Now, a paper can be perfectly fine in terms of, properly citing everything, but still get flagged with a relatively high number because, as it stands, Turnitin doesn't, really understand, fair use. It doesn't recognize when you've appropriately, cited things. And so a paper could have a relatively high number, but be fine. But ideally, you want to keep the number, low for obvious reasons. And I do for the real paper, the final version, I always do check to make sure that, plagiarism really is plagiarism. Now, in terms of turning in the final version, this is turned in through Canvas. And so there's no paper version of the paper, with one exception. If you're doing a draft of the last possible second and come by my office hours with a paper draft, I'll look at it, and I'll say more about this when I talk about the comment sheet. But in general, it's all done electronically, easier, etc. So for turning in the final version, I've created 3 assignments on Canvas. There's the on-time deadline when this paper is supposed to be turned in, and for that you get the extra credit of plus 5 points added onto the paper for turning it in on time. And this won't show up obviously as 83 plus 5 because that would confuse the grading system. If you get an 83 and you get plus 5, that would be an 88, for example. and you get full credit for turning it in then. Paper needs to be uploaded as a PDF file or Word file like Doc or DocX. Otherwise, the Canvas thing can't read it, and then I can't read it, which means I can't grade it. One thing to watch out for is never upload the Apple's Macintosh's sort of default word processor Pages, because it doesn't read it, and it's really, you can crack them open using some various techniques, but it's super annoying. So if someone uploads a paper in Pages, then I just can't read it. I just put a 0 on it until it's replaced. For the emergency deadline, that's a week after the on-time +5 bonus deadline, and that's everyone gets a free extra week in case something happens or you just want more time. You don't have to fill out a form for this. You don't have to request it. It's just a free week extension if you want to use it. And that is for full credit. So you lose the +5 bonus, which is for being on time. That's the extra credit. And if you turn the paper in after the +5 bonus, but before the emergency deadline, you get full credit for the paper. Then at the end, if you miss the first two deadlines, there's the 50% deadline at the end of classes, and that, as the name suggests, gives half credit. Now, each of these is a separate assignment, and so if you do one, when the deadlines for those roll around, Canvas will auto put in a 0, but the way it's set up is your paper grade is the best of those 3, and so Canvas is set to automatically drop the other 2. So one thing I get emails about quite often in the semester is someone will say, I did the +5 bonus deadline, but I have an emergency deadline 0 and a 50% deadline 0. Why are you failing me? And I'll reply back, of course, that your person's not being failed. They didn't do the emergency deadline or 50% deadline. There are zeros there, but of course their paper grade is based on the paper they did turn in. And looking at the overall paper grade will show that. And once again, the paper is turned in through Canvas. If you miss a deadline, please don't email me the paper, because it can be chock full of viruses. It doesn't create like a grade trail, in case there's like a dispute over the grade. And downloading a paper in Word, laying aside all the worries about, viruses and malware and stuff, it's just, to be honest, it's just annoying to have to go through and grade a paper in Word, because Canvas has such a nice system. And so, as a rule, please don't send me papers through email. Please send them through Canvas. And there are many good reasons to use Canvas, and very few good reasons to use email to send like a Microsoft Word, or even worse, like a PDF, or definitely like a Pages paper. Now, in terms of the grade on the paper, I have as you'll see, a pretty detailed rubric about the paper, how I assess it, etc. But of course, it's not like grading, say, a math problem or true-false test or multiple choice test, because there's a degree of, obviously, perception and subjectivity. And so the grade I put on there, I think it through, I apply the rubrics, etc. But of course, I could be off for a variety of reasons. So if you believe that your grade is not a just reflection of your paper based on what's in the paper, I'm always happy to discuss the paper with you. Now, the requirement is anything that would improve the grade has to be something within the paper. And so sometimes people email me saying, I need to get an A on this paper to keep my scholarship, or I need an A on my paper to keep my average, for whatever reason. Those, of course, are not reasons why the paper itself merits a higher grade. So if someone says something like, if I put a comment saying the argument seems like badly disorganized, there is no argument, and the student is able to go through and say, well, here's my thought process, here's my argument, and here's why you might have not seen it the first time. And I would say, oh yeah, okay, I missed a couple points there. But again, something external to the paper, like needing a particular grade to graduate or get a scholarship or fellowship or something, that does not give a reason to upgrade the paper. Now, plagiarism, the papers all go through Turnitin, which is another reason why I have it go through Canvas rather than through email, because then I have to load it in manually. And of course, if something happens, someone could say, well, it's the wrong file. So again, everything has to go through Canvas. So that way everything is properly documented, etc. Now, if a paper is plagiarized, I don't take this personally. I don't get mad. I don't get vengeful. I just put the appropriate grade on the paper, and I know what's been done. The person who's plagiarized, they knew what they were doing because it can be checked through the plagiarism checker, and then that's pretty much that. And again, it's super easy to spot because Turnitin just runs it through the entirety of the web, plus, repositories, and it does a pretty good job. Now, it is, of course, as most students probably know, possible to beat the plagiarism checker. There's various ways to do this, but it is a risk. So it's generally better to just crank out a paper at the last minute and submit whatever you've created, than run the risk of getting the plagiarism problem. And of course, there's also the concern of academic misconduct, etc. So basically, my advice is don't plagiarize. Now, for the paper itself, it's a issue-based paper, obviously in ethics. So the first step is to select what you're going to write about. I don't actually assign a particular topic because this way people can pick what they want to write about. But I do include on Canvas a set of pretty common moral cases. And each case includes like the actual issue, some background, suggestions for arguing for and against, and so that's pretty useful. So everything in the case file available on Canvas as a PDF, all those topics are like pre-approved. So if you pick one of those, you're fine as long as you like stick to the ethics of it. And so the first thing again is picking your case. What is the issue you're going to write about? You can select like a pre-made one, and these are pretty common things like whether abortion is morally acceptable or not, whether capital punishment is morally acceptable or not, technological, ethical issues like whether genetic engineering is morally acceptable or not. And if you don't find anything in there that's interesting, or you have something you want to write on, thing to do is just lippy no, not so I can like crush your freedom. That's the job of other people and not my job. The main reason is just purely pragmatically. I've had people write on things like taking care of deciduous forests, or the most effective way to raise a child, nothing to do with ethics, and they were good papers and probably got good grades in the classes they were originally written for, but nothing to do with ethics. So if you're doing like your own case, good idea to just like check it with me through an email or in class or something to say, hey, I want to write about this. Would this be an ethical topic? And in most cases, I would say, sure. Now, once you pick the issue you're writing on, for example, whether employers should have the moral right to get into your social media to check up on you, the next step is deciding your position on the issue. Broadly speaking, this would typically be, yes, this is morally okay or morally good, or it's morally wrong. And there can be, nuanced positions as well, where there could be like cases where this is acceptable like in particular situations or unacceptable in particular situations, etc. But you have to take a definite position because it's an argumentative paper and not there are many sides and let us, talk about these sides. It's here's the issue, here's my position, and the next step is, since it's an argumentative paper, is presenting reasons that support your position. So you think of logically, and if you look at the videos or were in the class where we talked about argument basics, you'd be arguing here. You'd be building an argument, premises, and a conclusion to support your position. Then, since it's an objection reply paper as well, you would also consider objections, which are arguments against your position. So essentially what you're saying is, here's the issue, here's my position, and it could be what you really believe, but it's also useful to argue about things that you don't believe, to kind of see the other side. Then you think about, okay, what are good reasons that I am correct? And then you consider rational, reasonable objections against your view, and of course replies against them. And that's kind of the flow of the paper, issue, position, why your position is correct, why your position could be, argued against, and then finally, again, of course, why you're actually correct. If you happen to believe the objections are better than your arguments, then just switch it, just reverse polarity and do it the other way. Now, the paper is a 4-part paper, and the course has 4 parts. I got a 4-part paper. It's, the rule of 4 or something. Be sure to label the sections for a very practical reason that each section has a certain number of points that it's worth, and I grade it based on those each section. So I look to see, okay, is this the introduction? And I grade it appropriately. Now, in some cases, even without labels, I can tell what the person is doing because they're clear enough. But to be honest, in some cases, without labels, I have no idea what's going on. And I just have to kind of like guess, like, okay, is the person arguing? Are they objecting? What are they doing? And if a person grading a paper is saying, what is going on here? That's always bad. And so one easy way to sort of organize things is follow the sections. So there's an introduction, an argument, objection, reply, and then last, and almost least, the conclusion. So now to a brief look at each of the parts of the paper, sort of the objectives of each, the point value, how long it should be, and what should be in there. The introduction, part 1, is worth 5 points out of 100. And so you'd want to, as a pragmatic matter, you'd want to put that appropriate amount of effort into it. As this is being recorded, the record for the longest introduction is about 6 pages. They, of course, got the full 5 points, but that was needlessly long. Ideally, it should be about 125 words or less, which is roughly a half a page in sort of standard, formatting. And the reason why you want it to be relatively short is because the introduction, shouldn't really drag things out to sort of like exhaust the reader. And again, as a pragmatic thing, it's worth 5 points. So you don't want to, spend lots of effort to get very little. For the content, there are 5 things that need to be in there. Each one is worth 1 point. The first is the thesis, essentially what you're writing about. The second is the case statement, if you're using one of the cases, or what you made up. Then third is a clear statement of your position. Fourth is a very brief statement, sort of, giving a very, very short overview of the arguments you'll be presenting, not the actual content, just kind of like saying what you're going to do. And then a little minimal background so the reader, knows what's coming up next. And this should be pretty concise. This could all be actually done in a couple sentences. So, for example, suppose you're writing about the ethics of the police using robots to kill suspects. Let's assume that it's in cases where the use of force is justified, because otherwise we'll be looking at not the question of robots used as weapons, but the broader issue of when is police use of force justified. Now, you could do a broader paper, covering both. And so in this case, the thesis and case and position, you could do all that kind of in one sentence. You could say, it is my view that the police use of robots as weapons is morally acceptable under the same circumstances in which force itself would be considered in general morally acceptable. To argue for this position, and here's my argument statement, I'll present an analogy between the use of robots and the use of more conventional weapons, such as rifles and shotguns. As an example of minimal background, I might say something like, in 2016 was the first known use of the police making use of a robot to kill a suspect. And that would, you might say a bit more, but that would hit all the points. So the thesis, case statement, position, argument statement, minimal background. And again, this should be pretty short because it's worth 5 points. And as a general guide, about 125 words or less. And if you're hitting like a few pages, that's way too much. Now, the argument part of the paper is worth 50 points and should be about 1,000 words or more. And that's roughly, if you're doing kind of the standard 250 words per page, approach, that would be roughly 4 pages. So what should be in here is as follows. First is the case information, and this is worth 10 points. This is where you'd be doing kind of the informative, descriptive, or maybe summarizing part of the paper, where you let the reader know the information they need to make sense of your your argument, so they get some context. Now, there's no exact length to this because depending on what you're writing on, you might have to say more or less. And your guide would be sort of like, well, how much would, say, the hypothetical average reader, how much would they tend to be aware of? Like if something is common knowledge, you wouldn't have to go into much detail because you can assume people know about it. If it's something sort of more abstract or less well known or highly technical, you want to provide more information. But since this is only worth 10 points, you wouldn't want to go on and on and on with a descriptive paper or a report because you'd put in a lot of work for little return. So for example, if you're doing something that is pretty well known, like abortion, you wouldn't have to go into great detail explaining like what it is and all the history and all the the legal nuances, because the moral issue in this case would be fairly straightforward. People know what abortion is. The only time you'd want to add more case information would be if you're looking at, say, a very particular aspect of it. You're really zeroed in on something, say, more technical or obscure. Something that is less well known, for example, again, the case of the police using a robot to kill a suspect. In 2016, that made the news, but people have probably kind of forgotten about it by now. And so you might want to provide a bit more background about how that worked. But you wouldn't want to go into like extensive detail, like laying out, the schematics of the robot or something, because the key details are, the police used a remote controlled, robot to kill a suspect. Now, again, you want to make this proportional to the point value. One thing I see happen quite a bit in papers, most commonly for some reason in the case of the ethics of surrogate motherhood, is 3 or 4, sometimes, paragraphs, sometimes 2 or 3 pages of just pure background, going into like all the different types of surrogacy, going into like the history of it, going over all the legal cases. And that would be good as a report, but in the case of the ethics of surrogacy, you wouldn't have to get into like all the history, all the different types. The background would be pretty straightforward. You just kind of say what surrogacy is. And again, if a person's doing, say, 3 pages that are a report, that's a lot of pages for very few points. Now, when in doubt about how much information you would need, thing to do is you can kind of use the reasonable reader approach. What would the average reader need to know? Or very pragmatically, ask me, put it in your draft, and I would say, way too much information, or you need a bit more. As a general rule, for case information, less is better. If you have a doubt about whether you need to include it or not, probably the better decision is to not. The next thing is arguing for your position. So you begin with your position, and you want to clearly state that. Just be direct with it, like, it is my view that, say, the use of robots is morally acceptable, or whatever your position is. And so it's clear what stance you're taking. And then the bulk of the section, 40 points, will be arguing for your position. And I won't go into like details about arguing here because in argument basics, see the relevant videos, also what we did in class, that goes through what an argument is and how to argue. So you need arguments in there. So everything in this section should be either the minimal case information the reader needs to make sense of it. And again, it's not a report, it's not a summary, it's not an explainer. It's here's the information you need to make sense of my position and my arguments. And then the rest would be one sentence stating your position, and then all the rest would be arguments for your position. So everything in there except for the very minimal case information needs to be, aside from your position, arguments supporting it. So sort of like anecdotes, personal stories, considerations of the history, unless they're actually part of the argument or critical to the case information, they're just filler. You'd be getting 0 points for them, so doing work essentially for nothing. Now, many people who write favor the notion of brainstorming, but there are also those who argue that that doesn't work. And so it depends on your writing style. But it can be useful, whether you brainstorm or not, to kind of think about what you're going to do like ahead of time. Maybe create a bit of an outline if you're that kind of writer, rather than just like getting to the keyboard and just, stream of consciousness. And again, writing is a very sort of personal thing. There are, of course, studies and so forth and scientific research showing what methods seem more effective in general. I myself favor, kind of a process of think about it first in my mind, usually when I'm running. It gives me a lot of time to think about things. And then I'll do like a rough outline by hand on paper. There's research that says that's a good way to think about things. And the reason to use an outline is very practical, because to use an analogy, if you wanted to drive from, say, here to California on vacation, one approach is just point your car to the west and drive. And that could be fun, but if you actually want to like get there in a way that's not like annoying and takes too long, you'd want to like have a map and a plan, because you're more likely to get there, and you can check ahead of time for things like traffic issues, construction issues, etc. An outline is kind of the same way, because it takes more work, but you kind of see, okay, this argument I thought was good. Once I've outlined it, it turns out it's not that good at all. So even though some time was like, so to speak, wasted thinking through an argument, at least, you didn't spend, say, 3 pages writing up an argument, then realize, oh God, this argument is garbage. And so it kind of lets you, test things quickly before actually developing them more. But again, everyone has different writing styles, so use the approach that works well for you. Now, the objective is to develop an effective argument or arguments for your position. Effective from the logical standpoint. So don't try to guess like what I think about the issue. You can easily find out, because I've written a blog since 2007 and I've written lots of books, but the issue is not, the way I grade it is not do I agree with you, but how well you argue. And as I mentioned before in other videos, I could agree with a person's position on a moral issue, but the paper could be terrible. I could also disagree with a person's position on the moral issue, but the paper could be quite good. And I'm very careful to not let my own views interfere with my assessment of the reasoning. And so the objective in the argument section is to argue, and for the methodology of this, see the argument basics, see the moral methods. So I won't repeat all that here, because that would make the video like probably a couple hours long. Now, the next part 3, is the objection reply. It's worth 40 points. It is 500 words plus, about, at least 2 kind of standard pages. Interestingly, and kind of unfortunately, people often just kind of like leave this section out, and that's bad because it's worth 40 points. So make sure you've got the objection and reply in there. And sometimes people raise an objection, but never reply to it. And that's also bad, because that's, right at the start, it's losing 20 points. So in the contents, you're doing kind of the same thing you did in the argument section, only like kind of in reverse. What you do is you raise at least one significant, meaningful, moral objection against your position. Essentially, you're arguing for the opposite of your view. So if you're arguing that something is acceptable, then the objection would be to try to show that typically that it's unacceptable. So if I'm writing a paper and I'm writing that the police use of robots is morally acceptable, the objection would be something aimed at showing you the opposite, trying to like refute my position, undercut my argument. And when we look at the moral methods and the various argument types, I'll go through, quite explicitly how to, reply, how to object to a particular, argument, how you'd kind of go with that argument, counter argument, and then of course, reply to the counter. And so you need to raise at least one meaningful objection that's an ethical objection, that's relevant. The next thing is, for each objection you raise, you've got to present a reply or replies. And the idea, of course, is you raise the objection to argue against your position, responding ideally to your own arguments. Then you reply to the objection by arguing against it. So it's position, that you give your position, argue for it, then you consider an argument against your position, and then you reply back to it. Now, the reason for doing this is to get sort of a understanding of how to argue and how to understand views that are different from your own. Or if you're arguing like for a view different from your own, you'd be learning that already. And it's very useful to be able to understand objections against one's own viewpoints. It makes you more able to defend them. And of course, it's a way to learn, because you may find out as you're considering objections, you may end up changing your mind. Also, by looking at a rational objection to your own view, it can help you understand people who differ from you, to see that, at least hopefully in some cases, they're not foolish, stupid, or bad people. They have different arguments, they have different reasons. And in ethics, in many cases, a person can still be like a good person and rational, but disagree on particular issues, because they're not believing it because they're stupid or evil, but because they've thought about things differently. Now, when raising an objection or reply, there's nothing like special or different about this. It's just more arguing. And so you'd want to build an effective objection and build, of course, a more effective reply. And as I noted before, if your objection is better than your argument for your position, then you'd probably want to change that up and make your former objection into your argument, and then make your former argument into your objection. So this is worth 40 points, graded on the quality of the arguments in there. Again, don't try to guess what you think I think is right or wrong. Again, you can easily find that out for a lot of things, but I don't grade based on, I really agree with this person's view, they're such a good person, they're going to get a good grade. I don't do that. I look at the quality of the reasoning. So good argument, good grade. Bad argument, bad grade. Now, I have a highly developed, detailed rubric for assessing this. You can see it in the paper guide, so I won't read it at you, but I'll go with I'll go with the excellent one. That's kind of the gold standard. And so this is what I'll be looking for in the argument, objection, and reply. And essentially they're graded basically the same way. And so in the argument section, what I look for is, does the author, do they clearly and concisely present the case information, the issue, and their position on the issue? So that's a key part. Then very essentially, are there arguments that are effective and well developed? So to the degree that the arguments are good, the grade is good. Then there's also the matter of, is it a coherent whole? Is it just like a bunch of arguments slapped together, or do they fit together to make a overall case? And making an overall case is good. Also is making it clear what the impact of each argument is, how it's relevant. To use kind of a obvious analogy, you can kind of imagine it if you've ever seen legal arguments, even in fiction, which are done well. A good lawyer doesn't just throw a bunch of stuff out there. They make it clear exactly what its impact is, what it does, what's the point. Now, you don't have to make it exhaustingly this is what this does, this is what this does, but it should always be clear what everything is doing. Now, in the objection reply section, there should be ideally a objection that is extremely challenging, and it is countered with a reply. And of course, there are the stylistic things, that it's extremely well organized, clear, well presented, etc. And that's the general rubric I go through for assessing it. Now, a good one does most of what the excellent one does, but is a bit, has some relatively minor flaws that prevent it from being excellent, but still good. An adequate one is, adequate. It's C-level work. It does what it's supposed to do, but it doesn't do it very well. To use a food analogy, an excellent one would be a meal of incredibly good ingredients, brilliantly prepared, served very well. A good one would be, a meal that's got, pretty good ingredients, well made, well presented, but, not not like 5-star, it's like 4-star. Adequate is, it's well adequate. It could be like your basic, decent sandwich, decent meal. It's nutritional, reasonably flavorful, won't give you food poisoning, but is just adequate. It gets it done, but not very well. Now on the bad side, a poor argument or objection has some meaningful, serious problems. It may be incomplete. It's got major flaws. It might have like a fallacy or two. The arguments are weak or poor. It's not like a total failure because it's only like a D, but it's kind of bad. To use an analogy, it's like food that's like left over and it's not going to give you food poisoning, but it's stale and not very good. Or it's like a meal that's freshly made that's kind of like junk food. I mean, it is technically food. It's not horrible. It's not going to kill you, but it's not very good for you. The failing argument objection actually has the biggest range because, D is like in the 60 range, and failing is below 60. So there's actually in a way kind of like more points in the failing zone. So it could range from like a 0, which is having nothing at all there, up to, is just really bad, but not bad enough to be like a D. And this is the broadest range. Again, simply turning in nothing would be a 0, and turning in something that's really bad would be, something more than 0. But even if a paper is like terrible, if it does at least some things, it gets some points. And definitely you would want to avoid the, poor or definitely the failing. Now, to help you avoid the poor or the failing, there are some common mistakes that I will warn you against. So here are some common mistakes in the argument and objection reply sections that really hurt the grade. And so you'd want to avoid doing these. One that's quite common is to turn in a report. And the difference between a report and an argument is a report simply says what things are or what you think about them, kind of a summary. And an argument paper, presents a position and of course has arguments, reasons that support a position. Now, the case information can be a bit report-like. You may write a bit of a report on, say, stem cell research or genetic engineering or something, enough so the reader knows what's going on. But it's fairly common for someone just to do the whole argument section as a report, just simply telling me about surrogacy, telling me about euthanasia, telling me about the laws governing, marijuana, or some other thing. And that's commonly done because people are more used to writing reports than, descriptive papers rather than arguing. Also, a thing I see happen, fairly often is recycling papers. A person might have a paper from, say, a political science class or a psychology class, and they'll change. Sometimes they don't even change the class on it, and they'll just say like psychology right on it. But it's not uncommon for people to try to recycle a paper from another class. And these are often like report style or descriptive papers. And that generally doesn't go well because they're really not on ethics. A second common mistake is writing a compare and contrast paper. Now, there's nothing wrong with compare and contrast where you present like one view and then compare that and contrast it with another view. But the objective in this paper is not to compare and contrast different views, although that could be a paper one could write for like another course. But the objective is to take a position on the issue, argue for it, and then consider an objection against it and reply back to it. So you're not comparing and contrasting two views, you're arguing for, against, and then for a position. And again, sometimes people will have a compare and contrast paper left over from another class and want to recycle it. And again, that usually doesn't go well because it might have been a really good paper for like an English class or a psychology class or history class, but it may have nothing to do with ethics. A third very common mistake is simply assertions without arguments. A person might just say cheating in a relationship is bad, and then talk a lot about cheating, maybe give like an anecdote about how they were cheated on and how bad they felt, etc., but no actual arguments. Now, many writing guides talk about, include an anecdote, include some personal story. Now, these can be relevant in ethics if you're using it, say, as an appeal to intuition, but in general, anecdotes don't work well as moral arguments. I mean, with some exceptions. And unfortunately, even if the story is interesting, if it doesn't support your position or provide some important, background, it's literally just doing work for nothing. Sometimes people do argue, but don't present a moral argument. We'll talk about this when we talk about mixing norms and moral methods, but sometimes people will present like a legal argument and focus on, say, a legal issue. Whether, say, marijuana used to be back before decriminalization, etc., used to be a very popular topic, but whether marijuana should be legal or decriminalized is different from the ethics of it. Now, you can talk about the ethics of a law, like whether it's moral to decriminalize something, but there's the legal issue, which is separate from the moral issue. Or a person may present we'll talk about this when we talk about appeal to consequences, a person may present like a medical or practical argument. So, for example, when people argue about the ethics of cheating, what people often do is say, well, you shouldn't cheat because you could get a disease. Now, as presented, that's just a medical reason. If you don't want to get a disease, then don't cheat. But that's not a moral reason. So if a person says, yeah, I don't cheat because I don't want to get, diseases, they're not being a good person. They're just making a good medical choice. Or as another example from the cheating case, people often do is say, well, if someone cheats, then it can cause like emotional harm, or may cause like reprisal, like the keying of cars or destruction of property or violence. And if it's just limited to that, those are just practical reasons. Like if you don't want to get your car, keyed, or if you don't want to get your stuff thrown into a dumpster, or if you don't want someone to like hit you with a baseball bat, then don't cheat. But if someone says, yeah, I don't cheat because I don't feel like getting whacked with a baseball bat, that's not being a good person. That's just not wanting to get hit with a baseball bat. Now, there are ways to use that particular, example. There are ways to take, say, arguments in law or practical or health arguments and using appeal to consequences, make them into a moral argument. But it requires, a crucial step. To use an analogy, they're rather like, that moral step is rather like an important part in like a car or a computer. Back when cars had carburetors not really like a big part, but your car is not going anywhere without it. Or, think of like the spark plug in your car. It's a really small part, but if you take out, your spark plugs, your car's not starting, assuming it's, gas powered. Another common grade killer is the paper is just not on ethics. It's on something else. Again, it could be about legality. It could be about religion, using religious, points or legal points, or it could just be way not even like close to any normativity. As I mentioned before, I've gotten papers on deciduous forests, basically a forestry paper, not about the ethics or anything to do with it, but just like about the forest, and papers on the most effective ways to educate children. No moral argument there, just basically probably like an education class paper that was recycled. And so if it has nothing to do with ethics, well, it's got nothing to do with ethics. It's a ethics class with an ethics paper. And so it'd be like if you went to, say, Taco Bell and you wanted tacos, but instead they gave you like a spark plug. I mean, you'd be like, well, thanks for the spark plug, but I'm really here for some tacos. Last thing, plagiarism. Every semester I get between 3 and 5 people in my classes that just plagiarize, pretty extremely. It just shows up in the turn it in, and when people turn in papers, they can check that. So everyone knows what was done. I don't get mad. I've had people like, fail the class or fail themselves by doing plagiarism. They come back, take the class again, don't plagiarize, pass. I don't get mad. I don't take it personally. I don't get vindictive. But my practical advice is, just don't do it, because turn it in. It's really good at catching stuff. And so if you do work that at least does something, you'll get some points. And some points is better than no points. Even if, this is kind of extreme, but even if someone just kind of like says, oh my God, the paper's due in like an hour, and just starts, slapping the keyboard, saying, stuff about ethics, they'll get at least some points if there's content in there worth at least some points. And plagiarism is, super bad, easy to catch. So avoid that. The final thing in the paper, the final part, is the conclusion. It's worth 5 points, 125 words or less, and the content, essentially, it's very similar to the introduction. And kind of a pro tip, you can copy your introduction, paste it into the conclusion, put the label on it, and then just make a couple of changes. One change would be going from the, future tense, I will, to the past tense. I argue that, as opposed to I will argue. And since you've already provided the, minimal background, you'd replace that with some final irrelevant remark. It need not be profound. It could be like terrible, but as long as there's like a sentence in there that's attempting to be a final remark, you get a point. And to be honest, I just put that in there to round out the 5. And that would be the conclusion. So last bit. As I mentioned before, the draft and paper are all done on Canvas, but there have been cases where in the before Blackboard and Canvas, papers were done on paper, hence the name, even though they're still called papers. So I do have in the paper guide a relic of that past, namely the comment codes. And what I used to do when someone would bring me a paper draft, first, my handwriting is terrible, which you may or may not see. Hopefully you won't see. And often people would bring me drafts like literally when I have 5 minutes left in my office hours. And so they'd say, hey, can you look at my draft? 5 minutes before I've got to go teach a class. And so I came up with a system of comment codes. And if you turn in definitely recommend against turning in a paper draft, but if you want me to look at a paper and you bring me a printed copy, what I would typically do is comment code it. I would just, take in my comment codes and just put those letters and numbers on there. Again, you only have to worry about comment codes if you do a paper draft and you're turning it in like at the, last second for me to look at, say when I've got 5 minutes left before class. And I keep that in place because that's still an option that can be done, but definitely better off just, turning it in on Canvas, because that way I can put on, more detailed comments, and actually type them out. And then, of course, for the paper grade itself, again, there are the options to turn it in for the +5 bonus. There is the emergency deadline, which you just get to use if you want to, and then the 50%, what I sometimes call the desperation deadline. And the paper is 30% of the class, so you definitely would want to do that, because although you could theoretically pass the class without doing the paper, that would require doing perfect on everything else. So doing the paper is a good idea. So that's the overview of the paper itself. And there are other videos that go into detail about the argument basics and the moral methods. This is primarily, of course, just an overview of all the structure and grade stuff. So that is the paper. So stay safe, and I'll see you in the future.